on the U.S. East Coast. Today's date is September 16th, and today we're going to do a geopolitical reset. That's my way of saying that there's just been a lot happening. I want to tell you the events I'm seeing that may be relevant, and then we'll do some analysis, okay? And we'll talk about big stories that are breaking out there. Before I get into that, I am going to say to you one thing I want to talk about is keep an eye on La Palma. For those who have been living under a rock somewhere, or maybe you don't follow the alternate news feeds as much, La Palma is one of the Canary Islands. It's off the coast of Western Sahara, which is technically kind of part of Morocco. Long, complicated story there, but it's run by Spain. And the problem is that there is a really big volcano on there potentially, where the island juts out about 8,000 feet above the ocean, and the ocean falls off about 8,000 feet underneath it. And they've had a swarm of earthquakes there, where it is thought by some people there's at least some risk that what could happen is if enough pressure comes from underneath, it could split the mountain, make it fall into the sea, cause a tsunami, and literally wreck the east coast of basically North and big parts of North America, Southern America, Iberia, Morocco. It's a mess. So the odds of it happening, who knows? I mean, this is something that has happened before. It's one of those things where it is a small probability, long-term ongoing event, a Yellowstone type deal. However, they've had I think over 600 earthquakes now in this month alone, and they're checking the depth of them because if they come up to a certain level, there may be a big problem there. So I'm not telling you to panic just yet. I'm not going that far. I'm saying it's a situation you need to keep an eye on, especially if you live on the U.S. East Coast or somewhere that would be affected by a potentially 100-foot tsunami coming across the Atlantic Ocean. And yeah, I'm not making that up. Really gets you in the mind of Revelation 8:8, doesn't it? In any case, good morning. So I wanted to put that little advisory out there for you first before we go into some other things. A couple other advisories, just things out there. I've got a lot of Canadian listeners. I'm reading that Alberta and New Brunswick are both going to be putting in vaccine passports. And I've read something, and I believe it's true. Someone correct me from Canada if I'm wrong, but Walmart's banning unvaccinated people there. So in solidarity, I highly recommend that people who are stateside or in other places do not have the opportunity or don't go shopping at Walmart. Listening to this from the start, so not live, but good morning, Tom. Oh, yeah, well, I'm here. This is me. This is live. I hear you. I see you. And good morning to you. Good morning to everyone who's here. I don't usually post the thing on the Facebook because Facebook gets me in trouble because people who like to cause me problems are on there. So I tend to use my Telegram group. By the way, join that t.me at Atlantic Homeland. And also at Tom Kaczynski. I'm over there. If it takes me a while to respond, forgive me. I'm doing this literally without regular internet access, which makes it a little bit trickier. So yesterday we had the most awkward alliance put forward, which is not a new alliance, but it's an interesting reconfiguration of AUKUS, which is the Australia, the UK, and the US, with the intention of building $90 billion plus of nuclear submarines for Australia out of Adelaide, which, if I remember right, is on their west coast. But anyway, maybe no, it's not. Adelaide's in the north. That's right. Adelaide is in the north, and that makes more sense for a lot of different reasons. Anyway, so what was entertaining, because I watched the press conference live, is that our president couldn't remember the name of the Australian Prime Minister. By the way, it's Scott Morrison. But what is more interesting to me is they boxed the French out of a deal worth $90 billion on submarines. We also have seen that during the course of this, that there is a seeming effort to go ahead and work on some level of encirclement of China. However, what I thought was most interesting about this particular event is that Japan and India weren't included. So there has been a lot of work to set up something called the Quad between India, the US, Japan, and Australia, which is basically, it's the same sort of thing NATO tried to do to the Warsaw Pact. It's a containment effort to keep China boxed in. So one of the things that I thought was most interesting about this is that we saw those countries excluded, and apparently the Japanese would have wanted in. And could it be an Anglo solidarity thing? Well, maybe, but it's interesting because there's the Five Eyes nations, which is the intel sharing development between Australia, the US, the UK, New Zealand, and Canada. And Canada and New Zealand are absent from this. And so some people people are drawing the conclusion that Canada and New Zealand are too close to China, which might make some sense, and that's why they were excluded. Other people are drawing the conclusion that Australia, the UK, and the US, all imposing their own social credit score systems, onerous passport regimes on their own people, and a increasingly totalitarian regime almost make a pseudo Oceania, the infamous thing from George Orwell's 1984. But what it also does is maybe it gives them the ability to save face, to look tough if China decides to go into Taiwan. Now, China's got a lot of problems too. China was counting on the U.S. soy crop to come in, and the damage from Hurricane Ida has destroyed a number of the facilities that's going to bring that out of there. Problem number one. They also have, I think it's called Evergrande, if I remember right, their second biggest investment bank's in big trouble, and it may be on the more verge of collapse. So at the same time, we are having insane financial pressures from economic lockdowns and stupidity. It's also impacting China because the global economy is integrated, whether we like it or not. And while it's better to be the producer who cuts off the consumer, don't think that there's no economic hurt for going ahead and doing that. So we see in this moment that China is now theoretically facing an invigorated response from whatever you want to call this triple alliance, whatever. I'm calling it Oceania. That's what it is, because we're living in Orwell world. Let's own it. We've always been at war with East Asia. And it's interesting how it's sort of boxed the Europeans out. And it's been part of my analysis for some time that Europe and the US have divergent goals. It looks like the Anglosphere, not surprisingly, is sticking with the United States in some way. Canada's an issue. We'll leave that aside for the moment. But that now France is going to be spurned. Franco-German cooperation is at the heart of things. And don't think the fact that the Germans have been playing so nice about Nord Stream, the energy pipeline from Russia, doesn't presuppose perhaps a reconfiguration where the French, Germans, and Russians come to some understanding. There's been a lot of talk about the Americans leaving Germany and going to Poland as well as potentially a reconfiguration of what's happening in South Korea. So the world may be dividing itself rationally into different areas. That's possible. Or these may be preludes to war, given the fact that Taiwan has been overflown several times by China at this point. The Chinese forces were sighted under 50 miles off the coast of Alaska, doing freedom of Navy operations, which, by the way, we do the same thing to them. So don't think this is weird, but it's provocative, right? And this idea of how and where we're going to fight one another, and where we're going to confront, I don't necessarily mean a hot war is a problem. At the same time, you have all this internal social conflict, which is very clear to you. Some of you have been following the very entertaining thing happening with Nicki Minaj. I won't comment on it in the interest of not losing my channel yet again, other than to say that I think she has the right to speak freely, and I am more than a little amused to watch people have to twist themselves in a knot over this one. It is your body. You should be able to be mindful and aware of what you're putting in it. I think that's basic knowledge that up until now would have been very easy to support. So what does it all mean? That's the question, what we wonder about, and if a war is in the offing. And it looks, I don't know. There is an apocryphal 4chan post, which, I hate to use that as a source, but I'm going to share it because it's interesting. And it's interesting as a concept. Let's use it as a hypothetical rather than any intelligence. Because if a hypothetical makes too much sense and someone in policy position begins to understand it, that's when things sometimes happen. So the hypothetical is that China could go to the United States and say, if we take Taiwan, will you let us? By let us, I don't mean, I mean, will you oppose us by physical force? And the rumor is in this story that the Chinese said just that they were going to attack on September 25th. In this rumor, I'm not necessarily saying that's a true date or something. I'm just telling a story. And that the American administration under Biden said yes, which is not altogether unrealistic given the relationships with Hunter Biden. You understand there's a lot of Chinese influence, especially in the Democratic Party in the United States, for various reasons. If you don't believe me, look at Eric Swalwell and the spy who loved him. So if that deal happens, and given that we've already shot our relationships internationally through the mud through our wonderful departure from Afghanistan, which, by the way, was the right decision conducted wrongly, what we may end up seeing out of this in the end analysis is that China might be given its Lebensraum to go into Taiwan. The Japanese might not be so agreeable to that because it will occur to them very quickly that if China breaks the first island chain, as it's called, and I guess I should talk about this, right? So there's the idea that containment happens by having different layers of defense. So the first island chain are those which are closest. So if you want to think of it that way, you could think of it in the Philippines in the south, where there's kind of a difficult relationship down there, that sometimes is friendly to China, sometimes not. Taiwan, Okinawa, where the U.S. is heavily stationed, is at the southern tip of the Japanese peninsula, and then off into the Japanese home islands, of Honshu and Ryukyu and what's it called, Shikoku. Anyway, so you head up that way, and then of course the Russians in the north who are allied with the Chinese, kinda. That's more complicated. Russia's always its own thing. Russia's always going to be its own thing. But in any case, so if China breaks out into Taiwan, what it basically happens is all of that chain is a threat for encirclement. And the Chinese have been working pretty tirelessly to build a blue water navy. They constructed giant, how should I put it? We'll call them canopies, but they're not that because they're made of metal. But they built basically giant berths into which to hide them. And now the Japanese, I believe, or excuse me, the Chinese have numerical superiority over the American Navy. Now that doesn't necessarily mean their ships are better. It doesn't mean that their naval doctrines is good, their weapons, whatever. But it does mean that they're raring up for the fight, no less than Germany was in the 1910s against Britain. Hmm. And they've also got a land way out now, right? Because they've got their link. They can now go from China, either north through Russia and through the very Stan publics, or they can go down through Afghanistan, into Iran, who's a nominal ally, I think, and get access to Middle East. So China's breaking out of its encirclement, and right now you have to wonder if that will lead to conflict. If the U.S. wants to push conflict, because there's also a thought that says the reason why Biden et al. Were out there doing this is because they want to provoke China into a war. Now, do I know the truth of this? No. And look, it's not uncommon for allies to jump sides. Let me give you a historical example. In 1938, Mussolini was actually one of the allies. Go figure, right? So, I mean, there's always a degree of flexibility. And then especially after when you look at things like the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, that the Germans and Soviets, people forget the Soviet Union invaded Poland too, but that got lost in history because communists are never painted as bad guys. Um, so you could see people jump sides. I mean, India is someone who, you keep an eye on. Maybe they can come to a détente with China. Not that they're going to like each other, but they're going to have to learn to live with one another. And if that happens and China can release that energy on that front and they have peace with Russia, they maybe are in a pretty good spot to go ahead and fight this sort of war. And it's kind of interesting who wants to die over Taiwan. Well, the answer is no one. And they're going to put up a whole bunch of words. Oh, it's a vibrant democracy. No, you know what it is? It's a an island stop that nobody wants to see turned over. Now there are costs to letting Taiwan go forward if they were either annexed or invaded, and the biggest one of it would be the loss of all those superconductors, the chips, all that technology that was there that we should have been building, in other places here. And honestly, for America, we should have followed the Monroe Doctrine and we should have stayed in the Western Hemisphere. Now, underneath all this, it's important as we talk about this at the level of nations fighting one another, we also consider the fact that there is a global effort on the way that's ongoing with what's been done with COVID to basically lock everyone down into permanent sort of submission, the citizens of these various nations. And there's that global aspect of it that has to be considered. How much of this nation versus nation thing is posturing to enable a new global synthesis? And that is a question that is incredibly hard to answer because we have seen at least some evidence based on their own writings and comments that elites have been willing to contemplate mass death scenarios of their publics to build the quote-unquote new world order that they had that Australian health minister talking about. A war would solve that neatly. It would go ahead and give the justification for all sorts of totalitarian measures in the short term, which we know, much like what happened after World War II, they will never go away. It also will remove a whole bunch of people, and it will allow a shift in narrative where now you won't have to hear about who and what is happening in COVID because we'll be talking about that. Not that those problems will go away or those mandates will go away, but it will go into the back burner, and that will be an issue. B, good morning. Good morning to my wife, Dana. So she knows I'm not home right now because I'm on here doing the show, but We'll go about a half hour today. I trust my wife will allow me the next 15 minutes to lay out some more details on this. So, where we're at is that we have a financial system worldwide that is suffering from hyperinflation, that we are trying to keep the wealth and status of elites in various countries, whether they be political commissars in the Eastern Bloc or whether they be, like they're in the West, the sort of capitalist elites. I should call them corporatists, that'd be more accurate, but I'm not here to defend capitalism either. So what ends up happening in this deal is that if the money's about to break, they need to have a way to make it go ahead and continue going forward. And this is one of the problems that's really going to be a huge issue. I guess I did spill some coffee on this. That's not great. Anyway, what they can do, the only things they can kind of do is they don't seem willing to restart the economy because they want to go ahead and compel people to be supportive of these various mandates they have, some related to COVID, some which are in no way related to COVID. And so they need an excuse of something terrible. Is it a false flag? Is it a natural attack? Is it a world war scenario? Well, all of these are on the table, but it looks like the war piece is moving forward quickly. And one thing I have noticed in doing commentary for these last few years is that political time operates much faster in the information age than it did back in the day because there needs mass communications and misinformation and disinformation, things are instantaneous. What goes will happen quickly and not lost on a lot of people who are looking at this. If from a purely military perspective, that October would be the month you would think that China would want to attack Taiwan. Why? It's after the typhoon season, the tides are high enough, and it's before winter sets in and presents other obstacles. Not that you're going to deal with ice in the South China Sea, but the way the tides work, the ideal time for them to do it here is probably within the next 4 to 6 weeks. And we'll see what happens in it. So I'm not really sure, but I do know that Japan is massively increasing the size of their military. I do expect they will be a nuclear power shortly, and that makes sense. And I'm not really sure what South Korea is going to do. I mean, it's a big piece of the puzzle. North Korea seems to be on permanent lockdown, which is nothing new. But we'll see. And I know that there was an alliance being worked out between Japan and Vietnam to help with some of the Chinese containment. And I imagine the Thai and Myanmar, I don't know what their deal is. I think China has a lot of influence there, and that might be a backdoor to India. But if China and India come to a détente, China will have learned the lesson of history from the West, which is that Germany kept failing at don't fight a two-front war if you can help it. And they're going to want to have a naval war rather than that. And China's fronts on this will be the Navy, and it will be internal subversion of the United States. Whether that be mass chaos, civil violence, do you activate people in the Confucius Institutes to kind of trigger BLM? Do you go ahead and you bring cartels across the border who can be irregular militia? There's any number of ways. And we're very used to thinking of war as our army versus their army or our military versus their military. War isn't going to happen that way. There are going to be many factions. And honestly, you're going to have a decision you're going to have to face if this starts happening, because at the same time you could have a war potentially between the United States and another country like China. And I'm not here to support China. Do you fight a war to defeat China to enable an American government such as Joe Biden, Jen Psaki, all these people, what's his name, Blinken, Mark Milley, the traitor, all these people would endorse? And the answer kind of gets tricky, doesn't it? It's like, do you want to help or do you not want to help? I mean, when you look at how the communists originally came to power in a country, it's because they didn't help the Russians. And frankly, one of the reasons the Germans lost World War I is because they didn't help the Germans. They supported their own idea of what was correct. So there's that level to the war. Also, where does domestic unrest go? Because if you see, well, that's exactly right. Don't fight for America. But the thing is, you may end up in a position, and I suspect if the major, huge war happens, where you'll have to fight the enemy from without, especially if it's the Chinese. If it's the Russians or someone you're fighting, I think the Russians would cut you a little bit of a break because they're still from Christian, civilization. The Chinese, they're just going to kill you. That's how they think. That's how they think of their own people, and you have to be aware of that. And you are welcome, John. It has been my pleasure to offer a couple books for that fundraiser. Come Out of Babylon. Go check it out on Amazon and whatnot. And I'm going to start doing some recording. That's the next book I will be recording, actually. So you will have a chance to listen to that. It's a good book, and I'm thinking I might write about how COVID may lead to a war. But the thing is, events are going so fast. How the heck am I going to sit down and write? It's just, and that's not I'm talking about my personal life, but I think it's a valid question that Gary brought up, which is that what do you do in regards of a country that hates you when it gets into conflict? And what you do is you defend your home, you defend your community, you defend the people who you can get along with, and you wait because in reality, you may see something where China is very good at cultural warfare. Um, they will understand how to set the country against itself. And America's underbelly, it's not complicated, it's the infrastructure. I don't want to get in trouble for telling the enemy how to do things, but it doesn't take a genius to understand that if the power isn't working and the water isn't clean, a lot of people are going to have a lot of problems. And Americans aren't exactly known for their self-sufficiency, especially urban dwellers. So I think people are not ready for the sort of chaos that would engender because you don't really want to fight America in the field. And this is where it gets curious. If I was responsible for arranging a strategy to fight against the United States, and if any of you, three-letter agencies want to pay me to be your red team planner, as a one-off deal, I'll consider taking your money. What you would end up doing is you would do everything you could to avoid conventional military conflict. You would go ahead and work to subvert and break the country from within. And I think that has been a long ongoing effort. And I would argue it's largely successful. Like the chick. Dana is doing a little bit better some days. She still has a lot of kidney problems, but so your prayers are appreciated for that. And if she wants to comment more, she's here. I'm sure she'll write something. So anyway, but what I'm saying is all of this stuff is on the very near horizon. And I will say if this is going to come to a head in terms of that sort of conflict, of an international conflict, for various reasons that are logistical, it is highly likely it will happen before the end of October if it's going to happen that way. And it may not happen that way, but China is going to look at this if they're of a mind to have the fight then. You see assets being brought into region constantly. You see that we've brought carrier groups into the South China Sea. You see Japan starting to rearm. It would behoove China, if they are happy with where they are in their rearmament process, to move quickly rather than slowly. And for domestic reasons that have to do with some of the issues they have there. Remember, we are all suffering in COVID land in a time of reduction, deflation, scarcity. I mean, we live in terms of economic deflation, even though we have financial inflation. I know it's hard to say. In other words, we have more money and less goods. Let's put it that way. And those two can run in different directions if you understand, right? Mm. That's it. Self-preservation, self-reliance, self-perfection, Bible reading. Uh, what else am I looking at today? So, what I think that America will abandon Taiwan if China pushes hard for it now. And I think it's actually probably from the American policymaker position, the right position. And I say that because we are not ready to fight a war. I mean, I think it's really interesting, right? I mean, it's really, let me make the China Joe argument. At the same time that our military is going to be stretched more than ever with more threats, we see these mandates being used as an excuse to purge potentially up to 40% of the people from the military. And you could never purge them on ideological issues. But because it's a public health issue, just like we've seen in law enforcement, just like we're seeing in healthcare, that you're permitted to remove people who have a sense of independence and who do not want to just slavishly adhere to the order. And look, I'm sure there are plenty of people who support um, the uh, the measures suggested who are not just slavishly following. They're just wrong. But Gary's exactly right. The jab does serve as a political proxy. That's exactly precisely right. And what we are doing, and we see the media's covering for it, right? Because it's saying, oh, the hospitals are overrun. No, they're understaffed. There's a very big difference. And why that has happened is because people have chosen they don't want to do certain things. And I will tell you, I don't necessarily believe the numbers that are out there at all about the number of people who've taken this. I know that the numbers of, who is getting sick from what are highly suspect because of the categorization. It would be very interesting if they had a separate category for the number of people who 14 days after taking these, whether they got sick with this. And I suspect if you did that from the bits and pieces I'm reading around the net, that you would find a great number of people actually fall into that specific category, which is currently lumped under the ones who haven't had it, but perhaps should be lumped under something else that Varus would be talking about. Mm. And when you look at that piece of it, you begin to conclude, well, they are rushing to do some different things, and they're allowing the agenda to slip a little bit with this Nikki thing on Tucker and all that stuff. So I do think that they want to move and shift the narrative along to the next catastrophe we have to deal with in the effort to see all of our liberties removed. And I think we need to be mindful of that. But I think that what was I going to say? We were talking about Milley. I think it's insane that no one is going after Milley. I mean, the guy committed treason and nobody cares. They have that Justice for J6 event this weekend. It screams trap. Anyone who's an activist is telling people don't touch us with a 10-foot pole because it's a setup, as much as the Michigan militia thing was, as much as all of these things were. And anyone who's sane knows you can't fight the man that way. It just doesn't work that way. Thoughts on General Milley? Yeah, I think it's treason. I mean, he's and look, back channel military to military links happen. Let's be real clear about this, and there's good reasons why they should happen. However, there's a difference between saying that, hey, we're going to keep a line of communications open between you, and saying that I will let you know before an attack against your country happens. Being able to talk to your colleagues is sane. Saying that, we are going to give you first note of a war that's incoming, that's treason. But it's not surprising. There's a lot of treason out there. I think that we are going to see, I have some open source intel, some friends in Arizona. They're telling me that they're actually going to finally get their audit numbers out there. Some of you may have watched the recall election in California with Larry Elder. Did you see on CNN how yet again 400,000 votes magically shift? Once again, the Dominion magical voting machines. We don't have elections. We have selections. We have drama and we have propaganda. We don't actually have a country with voting. And so as we go forward and this government requires and requests the support of you, remember, this is not a legitimate government because we cannot verify in any meaningful way. And they made it so you couldn't. There's no paper trail. There's no audits. If in fact this government is anything other than a selection made by a combination of media, some degree of intelligence agencies, and people with a high degree of technological acumen, both within these corporations and without. And that's all we have. So then you make the moral choice about whether you legally want to offer your allegiance to one group or another, and who you want to support. I can't tell you. But what I will tell you is it would be prudent to prepare for any scenario and to begin withdrawing yourself. And I would tell you in a deeper, more spiritual sense that honestly, withdrawing from this world is probably a good idea, because whomever wins a war of this sort of caliber will have the justification to build an all-controlling society where they say, we won the war, so they'll have the power to go unopposed. And they'll also go forward and say, well, we are going to go ahead and we are going to put this into you and that into you for safety and protection. And it's Orwellian newspeak, right? That they'll say slavery is safety or something. Where what we'll have to do is we'll have to be watched at all time. And if the war doesn't happen and we have a long Cold War, it will be no different. I mean, how much did the United States give up to defeat the USSR? We gave up so much that we became in some ways worse than the USSR itself. And that is kind of the bit and piece you have to watch for. You have to get out of the dialectic. You need a different way. I do think the Europeans are beginning to disconnect from the Western alliance a little bit, especially the Franco-German core of that project. It makes sense. Europe should pursue a third way of its own self-interest. The current leadership group, Macron, Merkel, all those people are not it. However, there is a way to do that. Look to your own history, Europe, and go forward. As for the Anglosphere, we're going to have to figure something out. And I will say, one of the more curious things to me, and maybe it's about the election up there on the 25th, is that Canada was not a part of this. Is Canada that much in the Chinese camp where they're worried about it? Is there a vision that says that, hey, maybe what we're going to do is we're going to see, the U.S. eventually absorb Canada, much like China's absorbing Taiwan, and maybe Australia absorbs New Zealand, and who knows, the U.K. and Ireland. I mean, building bigger blocks is something that's long been talked about. It's been prophetically promised, but it makes sense in terms of what they want to do in the world as well, where they want to have coherent blocks that are fighting one another. And you may see that emerge. How long have we been talking about, things like the North American Union, the Amero? You remember old Operation Blackjack for my conspiracy friends who've been around a while? Maybe we're finally coming up on it. I mean, who knows? But I know something has to be done because they can't go, and then they can't. They could, but they won't go back to normal as it was. And so they can't continue on like this. Too many people are mad. Too many people are seeing through the narrative, and we're going to see something different. Perhaps before the end of this month, maybe a black swan, maybe La Palma plays out. Maybe, we see war break out. Maybe we see, I don't know. There's a lot of moving pieces in this, but I do think that going forward, we need to be very aware that the United States, if we get into a direct conflict with China, or if we don't, either way, we're dealing with an ongoing subversive effort that I do believe will eventually break this country. Whether or not it can be rebuilt in meaningful ways is worth seeing. And we'll see what governors can do. Governors talk a big game, but ultimately, very few have been willing to do things. Like, I like what Montana did. I know libertarians will get pissed about this, where they say straight up, you can't mandate these things. And they'll be like, well, you're not giving people choices. Look, at some point, you have to say essential liberties exist, and the essential liberty to not be used as a pincushion seems like a smart one to me. Good for Montana on doing it. Shame on New England. We don't do better. Up here. I mean, it's interesting, but people are scared, and when they're scared, they look to authorities, and authorities provide leadership where they often lie. And trusting the wrong people is the crisis of our time in a lot of ways. So, what I tell you is not to put your trust in me, although I'll tell you the truth if I can figure it out, and at least my lies are plausible. Put your trust in the Lord Jesus Christ. Put your trust in someone who always told the truth. And put your trust not in this world, because it's going to shit really quickly. But put your trust in this idea that you are more than just a body to be jabbed, because we are in this last war. And what I told you in the previous thing, I was telling you, we are fighting against transhumanist collectivists. We are fighting against the combination of elites who want to live forever and activists who think that everyone can enjoy a happy time. And they are working together to create a world where humans will not have sovereignty. If you believe in having choice in your life, you're on our side. And it's okay if you hate everyone else on our side. It's not helpful, but you are on that side, because we are now being hunted by people who have a dark religion. And if you understand that, then all the other pieces come into play. And you cannot look at the micro level of states against one another without understanding this macro dynamic, that there is an effort internationally to remake the fundamental relationship between humanity and the state, where the state will not just now place allegiance and obligation on us, but that will fundamentally own us in meaningful ways by altering our biology. And that is the future we are fighting against for humanity. And never, it's like they said in the Hunger Games, don't forget who the real enemy is. You're not fighting, I'm up here in District 13. We're not fighting the other districts out there. We're not fighting FEMA District 2, or we're in FEMA District 1, but we're not fighting District 2, 3, 4, 5, up through 10. What we are fighting against is a system that says that our thoughts have no meaning, and that we do not have freedom and sovereignty and liberty. And people say liberty and justice is the American way. America's never had justice. Justice doesn't exist. Vengeance is mine, says the Lord. That's where justice is. But what we once had, at least here in New England, and I would submit for everywhere, it's a good idea if you're able to follow it, because you have to be able to work together, is virtue and liberty. And virtue is the aspiration to seek out that which is good. Liberty is the freedom to go out there and go forward for it. Don't pretend there's justice. Don't trust order. Trust God, and trust yourself if you're willing to walk that path. And if we find good people working together who support one another, that's the only way we're going to survive this, let alone any hope we have to get out of it unscathed. In the meantime, the rest of us can just stay out of the way. I do understand people want to get politically involved, and that we really just have to be smart about holding back. Look, I've been a dissident for many, many years. Look up my history if you're ever curious about it. You will not be permitted to get anywhere close to the throne. All you can do is take yourself away from supporting it. And hey, if enough of us said we aren't going to be a part of this, maybe the world changed. I have an idea. I've mentioned it once or twice. We'll see if you follow it. But I say, let's break the bank. And what do I say? I say, let's not increase the debt limit. Let's go ahead and break the dollar. Because you know what? If the dollar breaks, even if America falls apart and the world order falls apart, at least that gives us a better chance in getting into some war. And once we fall off the stage, what I would say to you is that there's a better opportunity for our people. It will be a time of hardship and austerity and difficulty. But on the other hand, at least it would be better than being drawn into a war, this endless pandemic hell. So that's my thought. It's the least bad option I can think of that's actually accomplished. And all we have to do is convince Republicans to do nothing. The one thing they've actually been able to do in Congress. So hopefully they can. And you lean on some Democrats. Because if you had a big movement to say break the bank, in the history of it in 2007, and I think that's when it's really started to get lost. The left and right actually worked together, believe it or not, to fight Occupy Wall Street and the Fed. We understood that we were under control of a system that didn't make a lot of sense, like I talked about in Come Out of Babylon. But the problem ended up being that then after that, the bankers got smart. They invested in this social justice crap and they started playing the race war game. And look, they may get that war, and that war may be inescapable. I don't like it. It brings me no joy. And at this point, it would be utterly superfluous and in service of what is working against all of us. However, it doesn't mean that the feelings aren't real and that the anger, the groups, and who's been funded isn't out there. So, what I would say to you when we think about this question is that we now have to go ahead and figure out some new battles we can fight that can bring us together to build some sort of unity. I'd love if we could fight for cause and country, but people aren't there and they're not going to understand that. So let's just fight so we can at least have the choice that we can agree to disagree, which is more than we've been able to do in a while. So let me see here. I don't have much about the FBI debacle or the U.S. gymnastic team. I know the FBI has been doing a lot of really creepy things lately, and it's interesting, they still think they're the good guys. It's kind of funny. They're not. I mean, I don't know how they see it. They're on their way to being the Stasi, but they don't understand it. And I know they don't understand it because they're just thinking, hey, I'm just following orders. And it doesn't work that way. It's not that simple. Let's see. I'm starting to think there's something to the idea transhumanist collectivist hive will be led as some sort of AI queen. Yeah, I mean, you look at quantum computing. I think that's a very realistic concern. That you will see something like that, and there's certainly an effort to create that. I mean, the people who what was it? My friend Tim, you should check out his work, by the way. He's on here sometimes, Tim Togstead. He does great work on art. But he was talking about they have a site called the singularity.net and how their big concern, honestly, I'm not making this up, is how do we make sure the machine intelligence doesn't leave us behind? So you basically have people like, what was his name? Cypher, the bald headed guy. I think that was his name, whatever it was. The guy who was wanted to be plugged back into the Matrix. These people are figuring desperately how to change their own anatomy so as to be useful to the computer because they worship it as a god because it's a greater intelligence than their own, and they see this is the fulfillment of humanity taking fire. It's like this Promethean moment, and it's high occultism, and in truth they're probably summoning Satan and all of his minions, and we'll see an antichrist, and don't even want to get into that today. But it's actually interesting how you see all these different religious leaders who have sold out, and I guess I'll say just one thing as a personal aside, that I am so disappointed by the number of Christians and the number of churches and pastors and priests and all abbots, all these different people who have just not had any spiritual discernment. I mean, do they even read the Bible? I guess they don't. I guess Luther's thing was all for naught. But anyway, what can you do? All right, let's see. With my experience in the system of small town politics, how a local level as a mayor town really make a difference, change at that level of power. The biggest thing that a local community can do is stand together and fight enforcement at this point. Build, like if you were in New England, okay, for those who aren't up here, we have something called the town meeting system. What it means is that we usually have either a select board or a town manager. It's like a council who puts in ordinances, and some of them get voted on, and by just them, and then most of them go to an annual event called the town meeting. And what happens in the town meeting is that the citizens, whoever shows up, vote on things. They vote line by line on the budget. So what I would say is go ahead and say, we are not going to adhere to laws like this. Like some of you know, Second Amendment sanctuaries. Another popular one in New England is food sovereignty ordinances. So the USDA can't come in and take you, cart you off to Washington to jail for having raw milk. Not even kidding. They've done that to Amish people up here. You build a chance to have a community that defines itself, and governance properly constituted should be at the most local level. That's what the Commonwealths were originally about. And I think that's how you offer the ability to offer resistance. That and the most important office you're going to be electing in the years ahead, in this context, is the sheriff. Make sure you have a good one. And I think you should be very open. Ask your sheriff, are you going to enforce this? Are you going to enforce that? And if they say, I'm just going to follow the laws written, that's probably not the guy you need. You need someone who understands that the job of a sheriff is to defend the interest of the local area and to make sure that the law is not capriciously put on people. And that may be your last line of defense against tyranny, because with at least that, you have the mandate of having some sanction and you can push back. If every element of law enforcement's against you, you're a slave. And that's the truth of it. And it's going to be worse going forward because a lot of law enforcement has been kicked out of office or is leaving office due to mass resignations. And there's had to be a little bit of pushback. But remember, they've made an effort going back fact, 2 years now to demonize the crap out of law enforcement. And it shouldn't, frankly, let's get rid of that word firstly. We don't need law enforcement. We need peace officers. That's the officer of the peace. That's what they used to be called before, police officers. And their job should be to keep peace at home. And the way you do that is not by forcing ridiculous mandates on people. I mean, there are plenty of sheriffs in places who don't do that. In fact, most counties are like that. And you need to be in a place like that. Those are places you can make a difference. The other place you can make a difference, honestly, is the school board. Get in there, read the books, make it big when people know, and kick out people who don't belong there. I understand that people who think government shouldn't do things aren't involved in government. That's fine. But the problem is people who think government should do things get in there. And that's why ridiculous ideas and crazy people get in charge of things. They shouldn't, because we are not involved. If I could be involved, I would be, but I can't because I'm too infamous. But if you can be involved, it's something to consider. And if people don't know you, hey, do it. Sit on a school board, ring a bell, draw some attention, read a textbook, and say, hey, wait a second. Because you're protecting your kids. The next generation is the ones who need to be most supported. They don't know any better, and parents are too lazy to check. And I know the smartest people take their kids entirely out of the school system, but you know what? If your kid is well educated, and it goes with 9 kids who are taught crazy stuff, and thank you for that, John. You just paid for my coffee. Appreciate that. What ends up happening is we now reach a spot where your kid is going to be in a terrible situation. And we've given away the education system for too long. I would have argued that we should have never given it to the public state, but that ship has already sailed. Truth is, there's not enough time to solve all these issues, but that's how you would do it in a normal world. This world being what it is, make alliances, network locally. If you can make a difference in your town, go for it. But understand that these things are going to fall off long before we can do anything else. And depending on how awful the state gets, will determine how much we have to offer resistance. But the best thing we can do now at this point is non-compliance and non-involvement. If the system has to shut down, I mean, realistically, if they're going to say, let's call it 25% of the people, although I think it's higher than that, just aren't allowed to work anywhere because of choices they make about their health, then in solidarity, maybe 100% of people shouldn't work. Or all those, let's say there's 80 million people. They say, all right, we're just going to take off for 2 weeks and shut it down. There's only power in numbers. And if you need to understand this, go look what Lech Walesa did with solidarity and some of those other labor movements. You need to have some understanding of how to collectively organize if you're going to fight this. One by one, we will be picked off. And we can't have leadership. We have to have logic. And I know that's weird, but that's the only way you can fight this. Because anyone who rises above, they can decapitate you. They can make up things against you. They can do smears. You can't do it. I wish you could do it. I'd be doing it if it could be done. Take my word for it. I'd shave my hair for this. I'm gonna clean up. I know I need to do that, but that's fine. So I like to do things in audio, not video. Good morning, Ross, by the way. Hope you're doing well. Glad for everyone who's with us this morning. If you have any quick questions you want to throw up this morning, go for it right now. I'm going to say the prayer, and then I'm going to head back because the wife is going to need her coffee. But it's always a pleasure to spend time with you as we are doing this morning. So I would just say, Heavenly Father, as we go through these challenging times, we ask, as always, you provide us wisdom to understand what your will is in all things, and understand that whatever difficulties and adversity happen in the world, that each of these is an opportunity to get closer to you and to find the way to what you want. Our choice is not to live or die. We all will die in this life, but our choice is what we will live for and how that will count us when we stand before the Lamb and see if we were written in the book of life. With the most important thing, of course, being to attest our Lord Jesus Christ as Savior, so that we can understand that we do not have the ability to fix certain problems, but in fact that we can just ask for help and forgiveness for our own failures and do the best we can these days. So I ask for the Lord to give everyone a double blessing of support to get through these difficult times, and an opportunity to find and discover your word in the Holy Bible that will lead encouragement in this very difficult time. In Jesus' mighty name, I pray that for each and every one of you. Other than that, it's going to be one of those things where we're all stuck in hurry up and wait. And things, when they fall off, may fall off very fast. Make sure your preps are ready. Food is going to continue to be an issue. Cost of things is going up. Hyperinflation is coming either way. If I am wrong about every other thing, hyperinflation is almost inescapable at this point. It's just a question of how quickly the odometer is going to run. They're running out of tricks to play, and the political unrest, which will be fomented, will be an inescapable element of making that worse. Be ready, be aware, remember that things are only worth your ability to use them, protect them, and trade them. And other than that, don't let this world change who you want to be more than it has to. Such an important message. I see people lose themselves all the time. We all struggle that battle. Lord knows I do a lot. I have days of despair and anger. And just say a prayer for Dana and I, for her health and for us to get things better settled. If I get things better settled, then you get more content. And if you guys support a little bit like Patches just did there, thank you very much. We will go ahead and we will try to have more shows. I did see a whole bunch of people I never thought would be allowed, and maybe this is because of that recent lawsuit against the App Store, back on Apple. I might be back with a podcast. I'm going to see if it's viable. I know y'all like listening to me bitch in the morning, so although you won't have the pleasure of seeing my scraggly beard, but maybe I can put some news stories up there and tell you the stories you need to hear. I'm usually pretty good at finding, because I realized what I actually do. I didn't realize this until very recently. Is I'm so good at going through information aggregators that are actually kind of smart at picking out what is useful and what isn't. I mean, there's some misinformation in there. There always is, but because that's what intelligence agencies do. They put things out there that are false to distract you. But you kind of get the gist of what people are scared about and where the what was the phrase they used to use in the aughts? Zeitgeist is, where the center of energy and attention is. So we'll keep an eye on it. Do keep an eye on things with China. This is going to evolve. Rumor is they might have their own counter alliance. If China, Russia, and Iran form a formal alliance, and they go so far as to say that, we're heading down World War III territory. Well, remember, though, I've told you, World War III is not a fight of states against one another. It's a fight of the people against the state. And when states fight one another, what do? They turn people into units and subunits. Don't be a node in a system. Feel free to be a wrench in the machine. God bless every one of you. You guys have a great day. I will see you again soon. Maybe we'll do a Friday night show if I have things work out okay. So, like I said, have a good night, good day. Enjoy the rest of your day, and God's blessing upon each and every one of you. Good day.